All right, welcome to the Business Leaders Cyber Briefing. We're going to be taking a deep dive into something pretty crucial today, especially if you're a business leader like yourself. We're talking about the changes coming up in 2025 to the UK government's Cyber Essentials scheme.
Right, so you need to know what's going on, but you don't necessarily want to get bogged down with all the technical stuff, right?
Exactly. Let's
Mhm.
face it, as a business leader, you've got a million things on your plate already, so we want to cut through the noise and give you the essential insights.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, these changes are about making sure your business is secure, that you can prove that security, and that you can continue to build trust with your customers and partners.
Okay, so let's start with the basics for those who might not be as familiar with Cyber Essentials. Could you give us a quick rundown?
Absolutely. So, Cyber Essentials is a UK government-backed scheme. It was launched back in 2014 with the aim of providing businesses with a really clear and practical framework to improve their cybersecurity posture. Think of it as a foundational set of controls, 5 key areas, designed to protect against the most common cyber threats that are out there.
So it's like a basic cybersecurity hygiene check, you could say.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just a theoretical framework, it's a certification scheme. So once you implement those 5 controls and have them assessed, you get that Cyber Essentials badge.
So a business can actually show that they've achieved a certain level of cybersecurity and it's officially recognized.
Exactly. And that's really important for building trust. It shows customers, investors, your supply chain, everyone you do business with, that you're taking cybersecurity seriously. You're demonstrating that you're committed to protecting their data and ensuring the continuity of your operations.
So it's not just a box-ticking exercise, it's actually about establishing a solid baseline of security and demonstrating that to the outside world.
Absolutely. And that's why it's been so effective. We've seen thousands of organizations across the UK adopt Cyber Essentials, and it's really helped to raise the bar for cybersecurity across the board.
Right, so it's established, it's proven, but the digital world, it's a fast-moving target, right?
Mm.
Technology changes so rapidly, threats evolve constantly.
Yeah, you're right. And that's why Cyber Essentials isn't static. It has to adapt to stay relevant and effective. We saw a pretty major update back in January 2022, which was really driven by the acceleration of digital transformation, particularly with everyone shifting to remote working.
Okay, so keeping pace with the times. And now we have another update coming in TUM 25. So what's the headline here? What's the big picture of these changes?
Well, the next version of Cyber Essentials, which is going to be version 3.2, will be coming into effect on April 28th, 2025. So mark that date in your calendars, because from that point on, all assessments, whether you're going for your initial certification or recertification, will be based on these new requirements. They're also calling the updated question set Willow, just so you know what to look out for.
Willow. Got it. So it's not just a minor tweak then. This sounds like a fairly substantial update.
Yeah, it's definitely significant. Both the core Cyber Essentials certification and the more advanced Cyber Essentials Plus, they're both being updated. So we'll see revised requirements, modified test specifications. The aim here is to address new vulnerabilities that have emerged, obviously to reflect modern working practices, particularly remote working, as we've talked about, but also to broaden the scope of what we mean by remediating security weaknesses and to make the whole certification process more robust, more rigorous.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. Maybe we can start by breaking down some of the key changes. I know there are some updates to the terminology used in Cyber Essentials, which might seem minor, but I understand they could actually have quite a big impact on how we understand and implement those requirements.
You're absolutely right. Language matters, and even seemingly small changes can have significant implications. So a good example of this is in the software section of the framework. They're replacing the term plugins with extensions.
Plugins versus extensions. Okay, I can see how that might cause some confusion. Why the change?
Well, extensions is a broader term. It includes not just traditional plugins, which we often think of in the context of web browsers, but also things like browser add-ons, integrations with other applications, anything that adds functionality to an existing software program. So the scope is expanding. It's not just about the main software you're using, it's about all the additional components you've added to it. And that includes things like operating system extensions, even firmware extensions for your firewall.
So it's recognizing that security vulnerabilities can exist not just in the core software itself, but in all the things we bolt onto it.
Exactly. And that means organizations need to be more aware of what extensions they're using, where they come from, and whether they're being kept up to date. It's all part of that broader security picture.
Okay, that makes sense. What's another example of a terminology update that's worth highlighting?
Well, this one's very relevant to the way we work today, and that's the shift from home working to home and remote working. Now, this might seem like a subtle change, but it reflects the reality that work is no longer confined to the traditional office or even just the home.
Yeah, people are working from coffee shops, airports, hotel rooms, co-working spaces.
Exactly. And all of these locations often involve using untrusted networks, which increases the risk of cyber attacks. So, by explicitly including remote working, Cyber Essentials is acknowledging that the security requirements need to apply wherever your team is operating, not just in a controlled office environment.
So it's about recognizing that the traditional perimeter of the office has dissolved,
Hmm.
and security needs to be just as strong wherever your people are working.
Absolutely. It's about adapting to the realities of the modern, flexible workforce.
Okay, so those are a couple of key terminology updates. What about the third one you mentioned?
The third one is about how we talk about addressing security weaknesses. So they're moving away from the phrase patches and updates and replacing it with vulnerability fixes.
Okay, so patches and updates versus vulnerability fixes. What's the thinking behind that change?
Well, while applying software patches is still crucial, vulnerability fixes is a broader term. It recognizes that not all security issues are resolved simply by updating your software to the latest version. It encompasses other actions, such as making configuration changes to your systems, adjusting registry settings, or implementing security scripts that might be provided by the vendor.
So it's about recognizing that sometimes fixing a vulnerability requires more than just clicking the update button. It might involve making more complex changes to the way your systems are configured.
Precisely. And it emphasizes that security is an ongoing process, not just a one-off task. It requires continuous vigilance, assessment, and action.
Okay, those terminology changes definitely help to clarify things. Let's move on to another fundamental aspect of cybersecurity, and that's authentication. I understand there's some key changes coming in that area as well.
Yes, definitely. Authentication, proving you are who you say you are, is absolutely critical. And following the 2022 mandate for multi-factor authentication, the 2025 update is taking things a step further by formally recognizing passwordless authentication methods as acceptable security controls.
Passwordless authentication. That sounds intriguing. Could you explain a bit more about what that actually means in practice?
Sure. So, as the name suggests, passwordless authentication moves away from relying on something you know, like a password, which can be stolen or guessed. Instead, it relies on other factors to verify your identity. And like multi-factor authentication, it always uses more than one factor to provide that extra layer of security.
Okay, so instead of a password, what kind of things are we talking about? What are some examples of these passwordless methods that businesses might start to see?
Well, one example you're probably already familiar with is biometric authentication. That's things like using your fingerprint or facial recognition to unlock your smartphone. But there are other methods as well. You might have a one-time passcode generated by a secure authenticator app on your phone or device, or you might scan a QR code with an approved device to authenticate. There are also physical hardware security tokens, things like YubiKeys, which you plug into your computer, and even push notifications, where you simply approve a login attempt on a trusted device, are becoming increasingly common.
So instead of remembering a complex password, you might just use your fingerprint
Yeah.
or tap a notification on your phone.
Exactly. And the great thing about this from a security perspective is that it makes it much harder for attackers to compromise your accounts. Passwords are notoriously vulnerable to things like phishing attacks or being reused across multiple accounts. Passwordless methods are inherently more resistant to these kinds of threats.
So stronger security, potentially even more convenient for users. That sounds like a win-win. Okay, let's move on to another area where Cyber Essentials is evolving, and that's around how it addresses the ongoing challenge of vulnerabilities in our systems. I mentioned earlier that there's an enhanced approach to vulnerability management coming in 2025.
Yes, absolutely. And this ties in with that change in terminology from patches and updates to vulnerability fixes. It's about recognizing that not all vulnerabilities can be fixed with a simple software patch. Sometimes you need to make configuration changes, tweak registry settings, or implement other vendor-provided fixes. The scope of what we mean by addressing vulnerabilities is expanding.
And is the expectation around how quickly we need to address vulnerabilities changing?
Well, the requirement to apply fixes for high or critical risk vulnerabilities within 14 days, that's staying the same. But the important clarification is that this now applies to all vulnerability fixes, not just patches that have a CVSS score of 7 or above, or that are classified as high or critical risk by the vendor.
CVSS score. For those who might not be familiar with that term, could you explain what it means and why it's important?
Sure. CVSS stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It's basically a standardized way of measuring the severity of a security vulnerability. So, a score of 7 or above indicates that the vulnerability is pretty serious. It means it could potentially be exploited by attackers relatively easily, and it could have a significant impact on your business, like leading to a data breach or disruption of your operations. So that 14-day time frame really underscores the need to act quickly when those high-risk vulnerabilities are identified, regardless of the specific fix required.
Okay, so the message is clear. High-risk vulnerabilities need to be addressed within 14 days,
Yeah.
and that includes not just patches, but any necessary configuration changes, registry edits, anything that's required to remediate the vulnerability.
Absolutely. And there's another important point here. The updated requirements also cover vulnerabilities where the vendor hasn't actually assigned a criticality rating.
So even if the vendor hasn't explicitly said, hey, this is a high-risk issue, you still need to take it seriously and assess the potential risk.
Exactly. You can't just rely on the vendor's assessment anymore. You need to be more proactive and make your own judgment about the potential impact of a vulnerability, even if the vendor hasn't labeled it as critical.
So a more proactive, more informed approach to vulnerability management. It sounds like that's really the key message here.
Absolutely. And to further emphasize this shift, the update actually highlights several common vulnerabilities that often require configuration or registry changes rather than just traditional patching.
Can you give us some examples of those?
Sure. They explicitly call out vulnerabilities in the older SMBv1 protocol, which is known to be insecure and should be disabled. Also, weaknesses in LAMN and TLM-v1 authentication, which are outdated and vulnerable to attacks. Then there are vulnerabilities in WinVerify Trust, which is a component of Windows that's responsible for verifying the integrity of files. And even birthday attacks, which are a type of attack against transport layer security, or TLS, which is fundamental for secure communications over the internet, are now explicitly within the scope of Cyber Essentials.
So these are things that might not be addressed by just keeping your software up to date in the traditional sense. You need to actively go in and configure your systems correctly to mitigate these vulnerabilities.
Exactly. It often involves using tools like group policy deployments or other system configuration mechanisms. And the effort involved in remediation really depends on your current IT environment and security practices. Some organizations might already have these settings configured securely, while others might have a lot of work to do.
So a good understanding of your current system configurations is going to be essential. Now, I want to touch on Cyber Essentials Plus, which is the more advanced level of certification that involves a hands-on technical audit. Are there any significant changes coming to that as well?
Yes, definitely. There are some updates to the Cyber Essentials Plus test specification that are worth highlighting. One notable change is that they've removed the word illustrative from the document's title.
Illustrative. Okay, what does that tell us?
Well, it signals a shift towards a more prescriptive approach to testing. Before, the test specification was seen as more of a guideline with some flexibility in how it was applied. Now it's more of a strict rule book.
So less room for interpretation, more emphasis on following the procedures to the letter.
Exactly. And they've also included clearer guidelines for verifying the proper segregation of organizational subsets.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, if an organization defines a specific part of its network as being in scope for certification, the updated guidance makes it clear that there have to be demonstrable technical controls in place to isolate that segment before the testing can even begin.
So you can't just say, oh, this part of our network isn't included in the scope of Cyber Essentials. You need to have actual technical controls in place that enforce that separation.
Exactly. It prevents organizations from just defining something out of scope without the technical controls to back it up.
Okay, so more rigor in defining the scope of the assessment. What else is changing with the Cyber Essentials Plus testing?
There's also a greater emphasis on making sure that the sample of devices that are tested during the assessment is truly representative of the whole organization's IT environment. So they've provided more specific guidance on determining appropriate sample sizes, the goal being to ensure that the assessment really reflects the overall security posture of the organization, not just a small and potentially unrepresentative subset of devices.
So it's about making sure that the testing is thorough and accurate, and that it provides a realistic picture of the organization's security posture. Okay, so those are some of the key changes coming to Cyber Essentials in 2025. Now, for business leaders who are listening to this who might be already Cyber Essentials certified or thinking about getting certified, what are the main takeaways? What do they need to do to prepare?
Well, first of all, if you're already certified, these changes will affect your recertification efforts starting on that key date, April 28th, 2025. Any assessments done before that date will be based on the current Montpellier question set. But anything after that, it'll be the new Willow set and all the updated requirements we've been talking about.
So timing is important. If your recertification is due before April 28th, 2025, you're good. But if it's after that, you need to be ready for the new requirements.
Exactly. Now, the amount of work you'll need to do to prepare really depends on your current security posture. So the best thing to do is to conduct a gap analysis against those new Willow requirements as soon as possible. That will help you identify any areas where you're not meeting the new standards and figure out what actions you need to take. It might be a few small tweaks, or it could be a more significant undertaking, depending on where you're at right now.
So understand where you stand against the new requirements and then make a plan to address any gaps. What are some practical steps that organizations can start taking right now to get ready for these changes?
Several things, really. If you're thinking about moving towards passwordless authentication, which I would highly recommend, now is a great time to start researching different solutions, maybe even run some pilot projects within your organization to see what works best for you. It's also essential to review and enhance your vulnerability management processes. Make sure you're not just focused on patching, but that you have a robust system in place to identify and remediate all types of vulnerabilities, including those that require configuration changes or other fixes. Conducting regular vulnerability scans is crucial for this, and then, of course, make sure your internal security policies and procedures are up to date. Update them to reflect those expanded definitions we talked about, like remote working and extensions. Make sure your team understands these changes and what they mean for their day-to-day work.
So it's really about taking a holistic view of your security posture, not just focusing on ticking boxes, but really understanding the spirit of these changes and making sure you're implementing them effectively.
Absolutely. It's an opportunity to go beyond just compliance and really enhance your organization's overall cyber resilience.
Right. It's about being proactive, not reactive. Okay, let's wrap up by summarizing the key points for business leaders to take away from this discussion. What are the three most important things to remember about the cyber essentials changes coming in 2025?
All right, so the three big things are, firstly, the changes to the terminology, things like extensions and vulnerability fixes. These might seem minor, but they actually have a significant impact on what's expected of you. Secondly, the formal recognition of passwordless authentication. This is a huge step forward for security and something that all businesses should be seriously considering. And then thirdly, the more comprehensive approach to vulnerability management. It's not just about patching anymore. It's about having a robust process for identifying and addressing all types of security weaknesses.
So clearer language, stronger authentication, and a more holistic approach to managing vulnerabilities.
Exactly, and these changes are all about making cyber essentials more effective in the face of evolving threats. They're designed to help businesses like yours stay secure and resilient in an increasingly complex digital world.
And if any business leaders listening to this feel like they need some expert guidance in navigating these changes, in understanding the new requirements, in getting certified or recertified, what would you suggest?
Well, that's where working with an NCSC assured service provider like Coolwater Cyber can be really beneficial. We have the expertise and experience to help you understand those new requirements, to conduct that gap analysis, and to put the necessary measures in place so you can achieve and maintain that Cyber Essentials certification.
Fantastic. So if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this, if you're not sure where to start, reach out to an expert like Coolwater Sober. They can help you navigate this new landscape and make sure you're doing everything you can to protect your business.
Absolutely.
And on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. As we always say, the cyber landscape is constantly changing, and staying ahead of the curve is essential for any business that wants to succeed. These changes to cyber essentials are a reflection of that. They're not just about compliance. They're about building a more secure and resilient future for your business. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time, stay secure.